She was hired to babysit a mafia boss's daughter. She ended up running his entire empire. Cassia was candidate number 734. She survived 3 days of psychological warfare, 22 hours of lie detector tests, and 4 brutal physical trials designed to break the strongest soldiers. She didn't just pass, she outscored the boss's own head of security. On her first day, she found dried blood on a child's toy. She cleaned it off without blinking. Within weeks, she discovered hidden military-grade surveillance devices the boss didn't even know existed. She identified traitors in his organization while reading bedtime stories. She dismantled enemy operations while braiding a 4-year-old's hair. When Orion, the most feared crime lord in the city, finally realized what Cassia truly was, he didn't fire her. He didn't kill her. He handed her the keys to his entire kingdom. This is the story of how one woman walked into a fortress built on blood and secrets, and conquered it from the inside. This story will show you that true power isn't loud or violent. It's quiet, patient, and dangerously competent. The most powerful weapon isn't a gun. It's becoming so indispensable that even a king must bow. If stories about fierce women, dangerous games, and rising to power speak to you, hit that subscribe button and become part of this community. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated? And if someone in your life needs to hear this story of transformation and strength, share it with them. Your support means everything. Now let me take you inside that fortress where it all began. Orion did not employ people. He collected assets. Candidate 734, a woman named Cassia, was a puzzle he could not solve. Her entire background file was pristine, which in his world meant it was an expertly crafted lie. She had survived his vetting process, a crucible designed to break anyone. This included 3 relentless days of psychological stripping, followed by 22 hours of polygraph examinations that focused on nothing but loyalty and ultimate intent. She endured 4 separate, punishing physical aptitude trials that were cleverly disguised as routine stress assessments. Not only had she passed every single one, but she had also scored higher on stress management protocols than his own head of security. Now, she stood on the other side of the enormous black glass desk in his penthouse office, looking entirely untroubled. The tailored suit she wore probably cost less than the watch on Orion's wrist, yet she somehow made it look far more valuable. The woman was calm. She was far too calm. Orion leaned forward in his massive leather chair, and the sound it made was deliberate and heavy. It was a subtle, calculated warning shot fired into the dead air of the heavily shielded room. "I have been told that you managed the stress test exceptionally well," Orion stated, his voice a low, polished gravel intentionally designed to grate on a person's nerves. "I manage stress," she replied, her tone even. "Stress in this building is not some university exercise, Cassia. Stress is the very floor plan of our lives." He made a vague gesture toward the skyline, visible through the reinforced viewport. Miles below them, the city was a cold grid of uncaring lights. High above them, there was nothing but the sterile, watchful silence that came with high-level surveillance and the weight of absolute control. He had witnessed hundreds of strong people completely shatter in this very room. In his experience, fear always revealed itself. It showed up as a thin sheen of sweat on the brow, the uncontrollable tremble in a person's hands, or a sudden, desperate urge to fill the silence by talking far too much. Cassia simply waited. "We discovered a significant anomaly in your history," Orion pressed, savoring the delicate dance of this power play. "A 4-year gap, government files that have been completely redacted." "A personal sabbatical," she answered. Her voice was perfectly flat, completely unbothered by the accusation of high-level espionage that was hidden within his observation. He let out a laugh. The sound was sharp, abrupt, and completely empty of any real humor. "Sabbatical. The kind of people who work for me do not take sabbaticals, Cassia. They simply disappear, and sometimes they are gone forever." He reached across the desk and picked up a small, brightly colored plastic dinosaur. It was his daughter's favorite toy, forgotten during a rare and brief visit to this sterile side of their estate. A faint, dark smear stained the dinosaur's plastic snout. It was blood. There was not a lot of it, just a tiny trace of oxidized crimson, but it was enough to catch the artificial light and betray its presence. Cassia's eyes carefully tracked the movement of the toy in his hand. There was no flinch, no sign of moral judgment in her expression, just pure, cold observation. "I assume you understand the rules here," Orion stated, deliberately dropping the toy back onto the pristine glass surface with a soft click. "This is not a job. It is an exposure. You will see things, terrible things that you can never unsee. My life is inherently dangerous. By simple proximity to me, your life is now lethal." He waited, anticipating the expected signal of retreat, that flicker of raw panic in the eyes, the sudden delayed realization that the astronomical paycheck was not nearly worth the constant physical risk of just breathing the same air as him. But Cassia did not move. Instead, she moved toward the desk. She took a step around the corner, and her movement was fluid, economical, and unnervingly efficient. She was not approaching the boss to submit. She was approaching the evidence to assess it. She picked up the plastic dinosaur from the desk. Her long, graceful fingers wiped the thin smear of blood away with a professional quickness, using a small tissue she had pulled from an inner pocket of her jacket. She held the newly cleaned toy with a careful, steady hand. Then, she finally looked up at Orion. Her eyes were a deep, unwavering gray, completely devoid of the panic or the perverse, morbid curiosity he so often encountered in people. "They did warn me your world was too big," she whispered, the sound barely managing to carry across the vast, silent room. "Too bloody, too tightly controlled for any outsider." She carefully placed the dinosaur back in the exact spot it had been, now slightly cleaner, somehow slightly safer. "I can handle all of it." Orion remained perfectly still for a long count. He was a natural predator who had just been calmly assessed by something that was equally sharp, equally dangerous. He had methodically laid out the danger, the unwritten rules, and the implicit lethal threat. In return, he had expected fear and submission. What he received was absolute competence. He hired her right there on the spot. He had to know precisely what she was. Cassia transitioned into her new role seamlessly. In fact, it was too seamless. The entire compound was a modern fortress, cleverly disguised as a luxury estate. It was built with concrete walls that were thicker than most bank vaults. Biometric scanners guarded every single door. Armed patrols silently swept the grounds every hour. And yet Cassia moved through all of it as if she owned the place, skillfully navigating the complex internal politics of the staff, from the cooks and the drivers to the personal security detail, with a quiet, unshakable authority. She never tried to gain favor with anyone. Instead, she demanded respect through her sheer, unwavering professional neutrality. Orion watched her constantly. He monitored his integrated surveillance system more closely than he watched the global stock market. His daughter, Ada, was the true measure of all things in his world. Ada had systematically fired the last 4 nannies, either by throwing violent tantrums or through a sheer, stubborn refusal to form any kind of bond. Yet, Ada had accepted Cassia on the very first day. He watched on his monitors as Cassia sat in the sunroom, patiently reading to Ada. The afternoon light caught the sharp, elegant angle of her jaw. She was completely focused, perfectly attentive, but always maintained a periphery awareness that deeply unnerved him. Every single sound from outside the protected room registered with her, though the rhythm of her voice never once broke. One afternoon, Orion entered the sunroom unannounced. His goal was to catch her off guard, to finally find the one moment where her carefully constructed mask slipped. He found Cassia supervising Ara's puzzle time on the floor. "The security report for the West Wing was compromised this morning," Orion stated flatly, his eyes fixed on her hands, watching for any reaction. Cassia did not even look up from helping Ara locate a missing puzzle piece shaped like a castle turret. That wing faces the public road, she said. It was always going to be the weakest point in your defense. Her tone was dry, factual, with no feigned concern for his corporate problems. There was no clumsy attempt at flattery. And you know this how exactly? I read the architectural blueprints before I signed your non-disclosure agreement, she replied simply. A good nanny always knows the escape routes before the child does. Orion felt an icy coldness settle deep in his gut. This was not professional dedication. This was high-level tactical intelligence. His eyes fell upon a small wooden toy car that Ara cherished. It looked unusually heavy, dense for its size. He reached for it, casually inspecting its base as if admiring it. Ara loves this, he murmured, testing her. She does, Cassia agreed, her tone still perfectly mild. But it vibrates sometimes. We probably need to check the battery. Orion's fingers found the tiny, almost invisible seam on the underside of the car's chassis. He knew instantly that it was not a battery compartment. It was expertly designed to house something else entirely, something digital, expensive, and dangerous. It was a specialized tracking device, high-end military grade, designed to transmit location and audio signals through heavy shielding. He did not need to open it to know what it was. He looked up at Cassia. She met his gaze without blinking. She did not confess. She did not accuse him. She just knew that he now knew. The silent meaning flowed between them, thick and heavy in the air. I found the bug someone planted. I know what you are really looking for. A gift from an old associate, Orion lied smoothly, his voice a calm mask. I should have it properly disposed of. It is always best to be thorough, Cassia said, retrieving the car and placing it on a high shelf, well out of Ara's reach. You never truly know who is watching. Orion began inviting Cassia to dinner. It was not out of affection, but to observe her under intense, prolonged scrutiny, far away from the easy, sterile answers of the security feeds. The dinners were profoundly silent affairs in his private dining room, overseen by towering portraits of his dead syndicate ancestors. Ara was always asleep during these tense meals. One night, their conversation drifted to the true cost of maintaining control. People think power is about taking whatever you want, Orion mused, slowly swirling the dark red wine in his glass. They are wrong. Real power is about keeping what you already have, and that requires constant, brutal vigilance. Cassia ate slowly, her movements methodical and precise. Vigilance is tiring, she observed, her voice quiet. Tiring, yes, he agreed, but absolutely necessary. I trust no one who has not proven they can sacrifice everything for me. Sacrifice is the easy part, Cassia countered, finally looking up from her plate to meet his eyes. The hard part is learning to live with the results of that sacrifice. Orion paused. This was not the idle chatter of a nanny. This was the cold, hard language of the operational field. And what exactly did you sacrifice, Cassia, during your sabbatical? He pressed, leaning back in his chair to watch her more closely. A slight hesitation followed, the only true crack he had ever managed to witness in her perfect composure. My ability to be surprised, she finally answered. The response was devastatingly effective, more powerful than any confession could have been. It implied a personal history too dark for surprise, a saturation point of trauma and extreme violence. Orion smiled, a brief flash of teeth that rarely reached his eyes. Surprise is what gets you killed here, he said. Do you understand that? That is why you are still breathing. The subtext between them was now perfectly clear. I know you are hiding something incredibly lethal. I am simply waiting for you to use it. The external pressure on his organization ramped up. The Hydra, a rival syndicate known for its surgical, targeted strikes, was getting bolder. The threats were rapidly transitioning from simple territory disputes to deeply personal attacks. The atmosphere inside the compound became as tight as razor wire. Security details were doubled. Orion stopped sleeping for more than 4 hours a night. He found Cassia awake at 3 in the morning one night, not watching television in the staff lounge, but standing silently by Ara's crib. She was not checking on the sleeping child, she was checking the room. Her hand rested lightly near a pane of reinforced window glass. "Can't sleep?" Orion asked, his voice low as he stepped out of the deep shadows of the hallway. "I sleep when the threat level drops below red," she replied without turning around. "Tonight, it feels purple." "Purple?" he asked, intrigued. "The color of a deep penetration," she explained. "Not just an attack on the perimeter, it means something is already inside." Orion crossed the room to stand beside her. He stood close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of her soap, close enough to feel the distinct physical heat radiating from her skin. The proximity was a deliberate test. He was testing her physical reaction to his power, to his imposing presence. "You sound like you know a great deal about infiltration," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I know how the human mind works when it is under extreme pressure. When the walls get too thick, people start looking for the thin spots." "And where," Orion asked, "is the thin spot in this fortress, Cassia?" She finally turned to face him, their faces now just inches apart. The tension in the air was not romantic, it was purely kinetic, like two loaded weapons being pointed directly at each other. "You," she said, her voice sharp and certain, "you are the vulnerability. When your spirit is broken, fortified walls become meaningless." Orion flinched, not from insult, but from the chilling clarity of her words. She had just articulated the fundamental weakness of his entire existence, the true burden of his power, a reality that none of his closest advisors would ever dare to voice. He took a half step back, reclaiming the physical distance between them as a way to reassert control. "That makes your responsibility even greater. Your purpose is now to guard that very vulnerability," he declared. "As I already told you," Cassia responded, her words a near silent whisper, "I can bear all of it." He turned and left her standing there, a solitary figure gazing into the heavily patrolled darkness. Orion understood he was courting disaster, yet the sheer thrill of observing her in action, of watching her casually dismiss the universal laws of fear, was rapidly becoming a vital need. He was already completely captivated by her refusal to bend. He gave the command without a moment's hesitation, ordering a complete forensic investigation into her history. He assigned his head of security, Marcus, the singular task of unearthing the true Cassia. He needed to know, no matter the expense or the legal boundaries crossed, exactly what kind of weapon he had just welcomed into the heart of his family. This quiet caregiver was either his ultimate protector or the most meticulously planned, patiently executed assassination he had ever encountered. Orion craved the truth with an urgency that bordered on madness. He needed answers yesterday. The paranoia he once wore as a strategic shield was gone. In its place was a sharpened blade pressed firmly against his own throat, and Cassia was the only one whose hand was on the hilt. The investigation became an informational void. Marcus, built like a fortress with the weary eyes of a man who buries secrets for a living, looked utterly defeated when he spoke of her. "Sir, her documentation is immaculate. Every background verification, every professional certificate, every single reference cleared without a single flag. But the moment we accessed clandestine data sources, her profile shatters into digital noise. She is real, but only in the places where an official record is expected to be." Orion remained seated in the growing darkness, the distant city lights outside his penthouse suite smearing into an indistinct gray canvas. "Redacted documents." "Not redacted, sir. Wiped clean. It is a total erasure. It is as if she did not come into being until 3 years ago, precisely when she enrolled in her first nanny training program." Marcus paused, the silence hanging heavy in the air as he shifted his considerable weight. "The only organization capable of that level of data manipulation is, I know who is capable of it, Marcus. Dig deeper, find the filth." I do not care if you have to incinerate the entire data center to discover a single fingerprint that contradicts her official story. Find the actual woman. Orion placed zero faith in perfection. An immaculate paper trail was, to him, a definitive sign of a deep-seated fabrication. A skillfully told lie always had messy edges. This was surgically precise. He started to monitor her constantly, moving beyond the simple static camera feed to the high-fidelity, sound-isolated streams from the compound's sophisticated internal network. He began treating the Nanny camera feed like a battlefield map, meticulously analyzing her every gesture, searching for the slightest inconsistency. The first glimpse of the deception arrived hidden inside a moment of childhood affection. Orion's daughter, Ara, owned a small stuffed lion, worn and deeply cherished. Cassia was in Ara's room folding laundry, humming a soft, aimless tune. She casually picked up the lion, gently stroking its frayed mane. Her actions were graceful and professional, until they suddenly were not. Her thumb pressed deliberately into the lion's left eye socket. There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause. Then, her fingers moved with the stunning speed and efficiency of a finely calibrated machine. She did not tear the fabric. Instead, she located the weakest point in the stitching, slid a fingernail beneath the thread, and extracted a tiny plastic disc, no larger than a pinhead. It was a military-grade satellite tracker, fully active and transmitting its signal, concealed with expert care. Cassia showed no sign of surprise. She did not even stop humming her tune. She simply crushed the small device between her index and middle fingers, producing a clean, silent snap, and let the fragmented pieces fall into the deep pocket of her jeans. Immediately after, she went back to folding a tiny pink shirt. In his office, Orion leaned forward so abruptly that his leather chair groaned in protest. The air seemed to vanish from his lungs. That action had not been one of self-defense. It was an act of routine maintenance. She had not reacted with alarm to finding the device. She had reacted to the operational need for its immediate disposal. This meant she either knew it was there all along, or she had been trained with such precision that checking for such things was second nature. When he encountered her later that evening in the kitchen, she was preparing a simple, wholesome meal, having politely refused the services of the compound's chefs. He decided to make his approach. "It appears the lion has lost some of its stuffing," Orion remarked casually, leaning against the cold, unyielding granite of the countertop. Cassia did not bother to look up from the vegetables she was slicing. The knife she used was thin and razor-sharp, moving with a deadly, rhythmic precision. "Ara can be rough with her playthings. We managed to patch him up. Did you discover anything of interest inside him?" The blade stopped its motion in midair, hovering a single millimeter above the cutting board. It was the only visible crack in her composure. "Just some low-quality polyester fill," she answered, her tone perfectly level. "They certainly do not make toys like they once did." Orion held her gaze, refusing to look away. He felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the icy excitement he typically only experienced during negotiations where billions of dollars were at stake. He was currently in a battle of wills with a woman over a child's stuffed animal, and she was unequivocally winning. Sometimes the most ordinary objects carry the most significant secrets, Cassia. A single speck of dust is enough to obscure the clearest view. She started chopping again, the tempo of the knife quick, even, and steady. "Only if you allow it to," she stated. He walked out of the kitchen, the vivid image of her effortlessly crushing the tracker burned into his mind. He came to a startling conclusion. The security screenings had been completely useless. She had not merely passed them, she had anticipated and engineered her profile to defeat them. The external pressure from the Hydra Syndicate was intensifying. They were now using the intelligence gathered over the last year, striking at vulnerable points in his supply chain and attacking his secondary properties. The entire compound was operating on high alert. The guards were on edge, their uniforms dark with nervous perspiration. One evening, A sudden noise tore through the fragile quiet. It was not a single warning shot. It was a long, sustained barrage of automatic weapon fire, erupting roughly half a mile from the perimeter fence. The entire household staff descended into chaos. Guards sprinted to their designated defensive positions. Orion ran for the command center, his handgun already in his grasp, but he paused just outside of Ara's bedroom. He did not go in. He simply stood and watched the monitor embedded in the hallway wall. Ara had awakened the instant the shooting started, sitting bolt upright in her bed and crying out with the sharp, piercing scream of a child who feels a threat without understanding its source. Cassia was already at her side. She made no attempt to muffle the sound. She did not tell Ara it was merely thunder or celebratory fireworks. She refused to lie. "Listen closely to that sound, Ilara," Cassia said, her voice exceptionally calm, deep, and authoritative. "That is the sound of people being extremely loud outside, much like when you stomp your feet as hard as you can." Ara wept, clutching her blanket tightly. "I am frightened. It is only noise." "That noise is an intruder, but it cannot get in. Power is what keeps us safe, and these walls are powerful. Touch the wall. It is solid. Look up at the ceiling. It is holding strong. The men making that sound are doing their work. Now, we must do ours. Our job is to be still. Our job is to be quiet and wait for the quiet to return to us. Can you feel your heart pounding inside your chest?" Cassia took the child's small hand and placed it firmly over her own heart. "Feel mine. It is steady. Yours will match it. Just breathe with me now. Inhale. Exhale." Outside, the relentless crackle of assault rifles erupted into a furious, mechanical storm. But inside, Cassia's voice was the only thing that mattered, turning terror into a simple breathing exercise. "You have to listen." She was not teaching the child to ignore her fear, but how to isolate and manage it. Orion stood frozen in the hallway. A deep chill ran through him. A normal nanny would have used misdirection. They would have used comforting denials. Cassia, however, used the terrifying reality of the moment as an instrument, reshaping his daughter's raw terror into a state of controlled awareness. This was not a technique from any childcare manual. This was operational stress inoculation. Marcus presented his second report 3 days later. It was terrifyingly short. "Sir, the files we managed to access were decoys. We traced their server of origin to a decommissioned intelligence black site located in Eastern Europe. That facility was officially abandoned 7 years ago. The files themselves were uploaded 6 months ago. It is a digital dead end, constructed to create the illusion of a believable civilian identity." What does that mean? It means someone is actively concealing tracks that were already completely invisible. They possess incredible resources, sir, far beyond just money. They have government-level capabilities for making individuals disappear. Marcus swallowed, his own fear evident. "We cross-referenced her facial data against every known database of international black operations. We found nothing. She is a complete ghost, sir, and that is the most profound threat we have ever encountered." Orion waved him away. He had no need for Marcus to explain the obvious. Cassia was an apparition, a human weapon perfected for deep infiltration, and she was currently living 2 floors above him, playing with dolls and his daughter. He had to confront the weapon head-on. The chosen location was his private study. He summoned her down at midnight, using the excuse that he needed her to organize some confidential files. The files were, in actuality, the detailed operational plans for the Lyra Syndicate's entire internal command structure. They included coded financial ledgers, logistical maps for their illicit cargo shipments, and detailed contingency strategies for extracting high-value personnel. He observed her hands while she methodically sorted through the documents. Her expression was completely unreadable, but her eyes, which moved rapidly across the pages, were absorbing the information like parched ground absorbs water. She was committing the data to memory, not merely putting it in order. Orion poured a small amount of bourbon for himself. He deliberately did not offer her any. Cassia, you surely grasp the kind of work we do in this house. We operate on a foundation of loyalty, unquestionable loyalty. I understand, Mr. Orion. Loyalty is not a cheap commodity. It requires an investment of time, energy, and sometimes the lives of those you hold dear. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering into a hushed, conspiratorial tone. Have you ever been forced to make a clean cut? To remove a piece that has turned rotten before the decay can spread? She neatly stacked a pile of financial statements, tapping the edge of the stack on the desktop to align them perfectly. A clean cut always leaves behind a scar, she replied, but it is necessary to save the rest of the body. And what if that cut demands that you give up something you consider essential to yourself, something you believed was a fundamental part of your identity? Cassia finally lifted her gaze from the papers. Her eyes were like polished stone, reflecting the dim glow from the study's lamp. Then it was not truly essential, she declared, her voice devoid of any emotion. Survival is the only thing that is truly fundamental. A faint smile touched his lips. She was not just speaking about his criminal enterprise. She was reciting the core belief of a seasoned operative. Excellent. Because recently, we have been experiencing some leaks. The questions he asked were like small drill bits boring into stone. They were slow, methodical, and designed to penetrate deep until they reached a volatile core. Orion studied her face, searching for the slightest flicker of guilt, the smallest tightening of her mouth that would expose her secrets. There was absolutely nothing. Her gaze met his, completely steady and unwavering. They are going to fail, Cassia announced with simple confidence. The rock is much stronger than they imagine. He had pushed her to the very brink of a direct accusation, but she had responded with nothing but cold, unshakable certainty. She was communicating to him, without uttering a single word, that she comprehended his violent world even better than the men he commanded. His paranoia began to twist and transform into something new, a kind of calculated reliance. He knew he could not trust her, yet he also knew he could not possibly afford to lose her. Cassia's sheer competence was the only barrier protecting his daughter from the escalating chaos just outside their walls. That constant, chaotic need started to dissolve the clear lines between employer and employee. One evening, he returned from a brutal but necessary meeting, an interrogation that had left his knuckles bruised and a fresh cut sliced across his forearm. He discovered Cassia waiting for him in the main hall. She did not ask him what had occurred. Instead, she simply stared at the blood that was beginning to dry and crust on his shirt sleeve. "You should clean that before it stains permanently," she said, her voice entirely neutral, devoid of emotion. He wordlessly followed her into the enormous marble bathroom. From a hidden drawer he never knew existed, she retrieved a sterile medical kit and immediately began to attend to his injury with practiced efficiency. Her touch was entirely clinical and remarkably efficient. She carefully cleaned the wound, applied a thin suture strip to close the skin, and then wrapped his forearm in a tight, clean bandage. The physical closeness was startling to him. Nobody was permitted to touch Orion unless he specifically allowed it, and certainly never with this degree of casual, uninvited intimacy. "You handle the sight of blood well," Orion observed, his eyes fixed on her precise, careful movements. "It is mostly composed of iron and water," Cassia replied calmly, securing the bandage with a final piece of tape. "It washes away easily." As she started to pull back, he seized her wrist, stopping her. His grip was firm, a deliberate and powerful reminder of his authority. "Who was it that trained you, Cassia?" She showed no resistance to the pressure. She looked directly into his eyes, not at the hand that was restraining her. "Life did, Mr. Orion. Life is often a messy business. You either learn how to manage the mess, or you will surely drown in it." He let go of her wrist. Orion knew that her answer was a lie, but it was a flawless one. It was unchallengeable, philosophical, and revealed absolutely no vulnerability. He was falling deeper into a trap he had constructed himself. He had become addicted to her controlled, quiet strength, to the unsettling fact that she could look upon his empire, his capacity for violence, and his deepest fears, and remain completely unfazed. She never tried to flatter him. She would simply assess the current threat level and adapt her behavior accordingly. His mind was a grinding war zone of internal conflict. The paranoid and ruthless crime boss inside him demanded her immediate execution. The weary, tactical commander needed her perfect precision to survive. He decided to intensify the surveillance on her, installing additional microscopic sensors within the walls of her private room, desperate to catch her in a single, unguarded mistake. He needed definitive proof that she was an enemy, something to justify the profound relief he would feel by finally cutting her out of his life. That proof finally came. It arrived as a small, heavily encrypted burst of data that was intercepted by Marcus's technical team. It was not a telephone call. It was a micro-transmission, a compressed packet of information sent from a modified electronic toothbrush charger that had been plugged into a wall outlet inside Cassia's private bathroom. The content was complete gibberish to the initial decoding software. The message was protected by a complex polyalphabetic substitution cipher, which was then layered underneath heavy quantum encryption. Marcus looked genuinely terrified when he handed the tablet displaying the information to Orion. "Sir, we had to bring in our National Security Agency contacts just to identify the type of encryption being used. This is not a rival criminal organization. This is the work of a proprietary high-level state intelligence apparatus." Orion quickly scanned the decoded message. The language was dry, cold, and technical, not a personal letter or a direct threat. It was clearly a field agent status update. Target stability is high. Proximity has been achieved. Vulnerability assessment is 40% complete. Awaiting the signal for extraction. Location coordinates are locked. Redacted latitude and longitude. The coordinates on the map pointed to a remote, abandoned freighter dock located on the desolate outskirts of the city. It was the perfect rendezvous point for a clean and silent exit. Cassia was not just a potential threat. She was the fuse that had already been lit and was burning down. She had successfully gained proximity. She had nearly completed her vulnerability assessment. The initial dangerous attraction, the admiration Orion had felt for her, instantly curdled into a toxic and lethal distrust. He felt the imagined cold pressure of a knife blade pressing against his own throat once more. Except this time, he knew with absolute certainty who was holding the handle. She had not simply infiltrated his world, she was actively dismantling it from the inside out, one piece at a time, starting with his own daughter's favorite toy. At that exact moment, the Hydra chose to strike. They were no longer targeting his supply chains. They launched a hard assault directly on the compound. The entire south wall of the structure erupted in a massive explosion that shook the building to its very foundation. This was not a subtle infiltration attempt. It was an all-out siege, and Orion knew, with a sickening sense of certainty, that this precise vulnerability, the specific structural weakness in the south wall, was classified information that only Cassia could have possibly provided. The game was officially over. The final confrontation was happening right now. Orion grabbed the tablet that displayed the extraction coordinates, quickly strapped on his ballistic vest, and charged down the hallway toward Ara's room. He was not going there to protect Cassia. He was going there to kill her. The air was thick and choked with concrete dust. The wail of sirens was useless background noise now, completely drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic weapon fire. Orion moved with incredible speed, keeping his body low as he navigated the corridors that once felt completely untouchable. The south corridor no longer existed. There was just a massive, smoking crater where a solid wall used to be. He could hear men shouting, the wet, sickening sound of close-quarters combat, and the metallic smell of aerosolized blood already mixing with the thick smoke. Ara's suite was located 3 floors up, heavily secured, but perhaps not secure enough if Cassia had planted other deadly surprises. Orion's grip tightened on his P-320 pistol. He was no longer thinking about loyalty or betrayal. His mind was focused only on bullet trajectory and immediate damage control. The feeling of being betrayed was now a secondary wound. The primary objective was survival and the forced liquidation of the traitor in his midst. He reached the main stairwell, taking the cold metal steps 3 at a time. The main power flickered and died. Emergency lights activated, bleeding a sickly green glow onto the marble walls, transforming the entire scene into something from a claustrophobic horror movie. The heavy steel door to Ara's private quarters was bolted shut from the inside. Orion quickly punched in the emergency override code. The door hissed open. Inside, Cassia was kneeling beside the bed. Ara, who was 4 years old, was silent, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear. Her eyes were wide but completely dry. Cassia was not panicking. She was calm and clinical. She had the small child draped in a specialized Kevlar blanket. It was standard-issue equipment for high-risk extraction zones, something that no ordinary nanny would ever have in her possession. She looked up at Orion, her face streaked with soot, and she was completely unfazed by the weapon he had pointed squarely at the center of her chest. "It took you long enough to get here," Cassia said. Her voice was flat and dry. There was no fear in her tone, and no hint of an apology. Orion did not lower the gun. "The coordinates, Cassia. The dock. The extraction signal." He crossed the large room in 2 massive strides. He slammed the flat side of the pistol hard against her temple, using the momentum to pull her up and pin her against the wall. The Kevlar blanket slipped from the child's shoulders. Ara whimpered, a tiny sound that was lost in the growing sounds of war just outside. "Who sent you here?" Orion's voice was a low, grinding growl, raw and extremely dangerous. "Does it really matter at this point?" Cassia did not flinch. Her breathing remained steady, almost like she was meditating. "The south wall. You provided them with the schematics." "I provided them with the weakness," she corrected him, her tone sharp and brutal. "That was my mandate. Infiltrate the organization, assess its vulnerabilities, and then exploit them." "And what about the status report? Target stability high." "Was that about me, Cassia? Was I the primary target?" Another massive blast shook the entire wing of the building. A large piece of plaster from the ceiling broke loose and fell, grazing Orion's shoulder as it crashed to the floor. The building groaned under the assault. "Initially, yes, you were," she admitted. Her eyes were sharp, but they were focused on something behind him, not on his face. "The mission was a clean cut. Dismantle the Lyra Syndicate from the head of the organization down. Get out clean." "What changed your mind?" He pressed the muzzle of the gun harder against her skin, drawing a thin line of red blood. "You did," she whispered. It was not dramatic, just a simple statement of fact. "And her." Her eyes darted quickly toward Ara. "Your world is an ugly place, Orion, but at least it is real. My old world was just a projection, a complete lie. I saw the way you protect her. I saw what you hide underneath all of that control." The door's security alarm suddenly screamed to life. A rapid series of focused explosions tore through the exterior hallway access point. The Hydra was not using rifles to breach the secure door. They were using specialized breaching charges, which were specific and precisely targeted. "They are coming through the ventilation shafts on level 2, Cassia suddenly snapped, completely ignoring the gun pressed against her head. "And through the eastern emergency hatch. It is a standard 3-pronged high-value extraction pattern. They are not here to kill you. They are here to take you alive." Orion hesitated for a fraction of a second. The incredible level of detail, the immediate and flawless tactical assessment, was undeniable. It was the language of a seasoned field commander, not a glorified babysitter. "How do you know all of that?" "Because I trained their trainers," Cassia said, pushing his gun hand away with a sudden, precise movement that disarmed him without any real violence. The P-320 spun once in the air before he managed to catch it. She had moved too fast, with too much efficiency. The stark reality of her capabilities was like a cold slap across his face. "Get Ara into the panic room now," Orion ordered, instantly switching his priorities. Survival was more important than revenge. He could always shoot her later. It was too late. A squad of 5 men, clad in heavy armor and black tactical gear, burst through the fractured hallway door. They moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency that was terrifying to watch. These were not the Syndicate's hired muscle. These were trained professionals using suppressed weapons, moving together as a single, lethal unit. Orion fired his pistol twice. He aimed for center mass. The body armor held, but the sheer impact of the rounds staggered 2 of the attackers. Cassia did not waste precious ammunition. She grabbed a heavy bronze lamp from the bedside table and hurled it directly at the lead man's faceplate, blinding him for a crucial moment. Then she moved, fast and fluid. She was not just fighting them, she was systematically neutralizing them. She executed a perfect leg sweep, delivered a pressure point strike to a man's throat, and then used a borrowed knife from one of the downed men to plunge it instantly into the weak armor seams near his shoulder. Orion handled the other 3 with pure fury and brute muscle. He used the environment to his advantage, slamming one attacker into the reinforced glass of the balcony door, and then emptying his entire magazine into another's head once the helmet finally cracked under the repeated blunt force trauma. It was a brutal, unplanned dance, and they moved as one. Orion saw a terrifying efficiency in Cassia's every action. There was no wasted motion, only devastating violence. Her eyes saw threats before he could even process them. She was a machine built for killing. But then the unthinkable happened. The last man from the initial assault got behind Orion. He raised a silenced firearm, aimed directly at an exposed spot. Cassia saw the threat instantly. She also saw her escape, the emergency vent she had already located. It was her clear path to freedom. She threw that chance away. She launched herself across the room, tackling Orion as the attacker fired. The quiet burst of rounds slammed into the wall where his head had been, raining down plaster and hot metal. A person with that much power could have escaped. So why did she choose to protect him? Without pausing, she rolled and grabbed the P320 he had dropped. She fired 2 precise shots into the vulnerable gap where the soldier's helmet met his body armor. The man collapsed. Silence crashed down, broken only by the harsh, ragged breathing of the 2 survivors. Cassia lay on the ground, the gun steady despite her exhaustion. Her mission was over. Her clean exit was gone. The entire structured world she knew was ruined, a casualty of her own choice. She had just sacrificed it all to save the one man she was supposed to destroy. She had chosen this chaos. Orion looked down, and what he felt was not attraction or even praise. It was a terrifying recognition. She had not just endured his violent world, she had actively chosen to make it her own, burning every single path that led back home. He reached down and offered her a hand. It was stained with his own blood and the blood of the men lying dead around them. She took it without hesitation, and he pulled her to her feet. The air was thick, tasting of gunpowder, sweat, and the metallic tang of shared violence. Alarms continued to shriek throughout the facility. "More will be coming," Orion stated. He reloaded his weapon with a practiced efficiency that was purely mechanical. "I know," Cassia replied. She was already checking the ammunition in her borrowed pistol and scanning the room for tactical advantages. "Where are the schematics for the sublevels?" Every barrier of distrust had just collapsed. All that remained was the cold, immediate need to survive. She was demanding the keys to his entire kingdom. Orion did not waste a single moment with questions. Trust was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was competence, and she had demonstrated it in spades. He went to a hidden steel panel behind his desk and tore away the false covering. A quiet hiss of compressed air sounded as the door slid open, revealing a tactical data tablet. He tossed it to her. "Sublevels 2 through 5, he explained. "They are advancing through the service tunnels. They breached our secondary firewall 5 minutes ago." Cassia caught the tablet easily with one hand. Her eyes devoured the complex blueprints, seeing layers of information for ventilation shafts, power conduits, and key defensive positions. Her finger immediately stabbed a single point on the glowing map. It was an old, forgotten steam pipe junction located dangerously close to the mainframe. "This is the weak point right here," she said, her voice completely calm and devoid of fear. "The structure is not sound. If they use thermal charges on this spot, the main support column will collapse. We have to stop them before they reach it." Orion gave a single, sharp nod. There was no room for debate. He picked up a heavy assault rifle, the weapon feeling cold and right in his hands. They began to move with purpose, not a frantic run, but the calculated, low-to-the-ground advance of people who understood the deadly geometry of a firefight. The hallway outside his office was a scene of carnage. It was a ruin of twisted steel, shattered safety glass, and the thick, coppery smell of blood that stained the walls. Orion was like a force of nature, using overwhelming firepower to clear the way. He was pure kinetic energy, prioritizing destruction over subtlety. Cassia moved in a completely different way. She was like water finding its way around obstacles. Her steps were completely silent, her actions precise and deadly. While Orion might use 3 rounds to suppress a threat, she used a single bullet aimed at the central nervous system or a major artery. She guaranteed a stop with every pull of the trigger. Her motions were a study in deadly economy. They finally arrived at the stairwell that led to the lower floors. 2 Hydra soldiers were coming up, their attention focused on securing the level above them. Orion started to lift his rifle. Cassia put a hand on his arm, pulling him back into the shadows of a recessed doorway. "Noise brings more of them," she whispered, her voice right next to his ear. "We let them go by. We move down. We cut the head off the snake." He paused for a fraction of a second, a man unaccustomed to taking orders, but her logic was flawless. He lowered his rifle. He could feel the intense heat coming from her body, the readiness of a predator coiled to strike. The heavy footsteps of the 2 soldiers pounded past their hiding spot, their owners completely unaware. As the sounds faded down the hall, Cassia was already descending the stairs, taking them 3 at a time while staying deep within the shadows. The sub-levels were a network of narrow, suffocating concrete tunnels. They were built for maintenance workers, not for combat. Down here, the air grew colder, and it was thick with the scent of ozone and machine grease. The quiet itself felt menacing, like a silence just waiting for the explosion of gunfire. "This is Hydra's preferred battleground," Orion muttered as they navigated a sharp corner. "They train for sieges in tunnels like these." "I know their methods," Cassia answered, her eyes fixed on the heat signatures appearing on the tablet. "They always depend on flooding an area with overwhelming numbers and firepower. A precise surgical strike is the last thing they will be expecting." They soon reached the final defensive position that guarded the central computer chamber. 4 soldiers in heavy armor were positioned behind barricades they had built from server racks. Orion could hear their muffled, urgent voices on their communicators, discussing thermal charges and the building's structural weaknesses. He prepared to attack. His instinct was to charge directly at the threat. But Cassia stopped him again, her hand gripping his tactical vest with authority. This time, her hold was a silent command that he could not ignore. She pointed upward, toward a ventilation shaft positioned directly above the enemy barricade. It was far too small for Orion's frame, designed only for cables and small drones, but it was perfectly sized for her. "Distraction," she said, her word clipped and precise, her eyes locked on the hostile positions. "You make a lot of noise and draw all their fire. I will go over the top, cut their communications, and kill the lights. Then we can finish them." Orion looked at her face, which was faintly illuminated by the red emergency lighting. She was not suggesting a strategy or asking for his opinion. She was giving him his assignment. It was a sudden, complete reversal of their power dynamic. He felt a sharp and dangerous excitement at the realization. He was no longer fighting this battle alone. He was now fighting alongside someone just as deadly and just as strategic as he was. Fine, he bit out, accepting his new role in this confined battlefield. He then unleashed absolute chaos. A long, sustained burst of automatic fire tore into the server racks, filling the air with sparks and flying metal. The Hydra soldiers reacted instantly, returning fire and pinning Orion behind a concrete pillar. Their attention was completely fixed on him. As she had predicted, their overwhelming fire was aimed entirely at the source of the noise. Cassia was already gone. She had scaled the wall without a sound, locating the hidden handle on the ventilation duct. She disappeared inside with the fluid, unnerving grace of a person born for infiltration, her body easily fitting into the cramped passage. Within the total darkness of the shaft, she moved with the speed and silence of flowing mercury. When she dropped from the ceiling behind the fortified soldiers, she did not even use her gun. Instead, she used a specialized retractable wire, a tool Orion recognized from highly classified intelligence reports on elite assassins. It was a weapon designed for silent, efficient killing. The work was fast and brutal. The first two soldiers were dead before their teammates even noticed that the radios had gone silent and the main lights had blinked out. By that point, Cassia had already broken the neck of the third soldier. The last man spun around, firing blindly into the darkness, his actions driven by pure panic at the sudden, quiet death of his entire squad. That was the opening Orion needed. He rolled out from his cover and sent a controlled, lethal burst of gunfire into the soldier's unprotected chest. And then it was over. The silence that came next was absolute and suffocating. Orion moved cautiously into the chamber, carefully stepping around the bodies. He saw Cassia standing over the last man she had killed, her breathing only slightly uneven. She was not covered in blood, only in the dust and grime from the ventilation shafts. She was in complete control, the perfect professional. She looked up at him, her expression impossible to read. There was no victory, no regret, only the quiet satisfaction of a completed task. The entire compound was now silent. The last of the distant alarms whined down and then stopped completely. The Hydra assault had been shattered. The leadership of the attack was gone. Orion stood among the ruins of his own fortress. The destruction was severe. His security networks were destroyed, and his personnel losses were high. But he was still alive. More importantly, his daughter was safe, hidden deep inside the compound's emergency bunker. He looked over at Cassia. A sliver of light from a broken window illuminated the fine layer of dust that had settled in her hair. In just 10 minutes, she had systematically dismantled a team of professional mercenaries, saved his life on 2 separate occasions, and effortlessly navigated his most secret defenses. He did not have to wonder why she chose to stay and fight. He could see the answer in the way she still held her weapon, the way her eyes continued to scan the exits for new threats, and in the memory of her abandoning a perfect escape. She had given up her old life to take on the burden of his. He began to walk toward her, the soles of his heavy boots crunching on broken ceramic floor tiles. He stopped about a foot away from her, just close enough to be a potential threat, yet far enough to respect the dangerous space between them. "The mission," Orion said, his voice a low gravel. "Tell me what your mandate was. I want the whole truth this time. No more games." Cassia met his gaze without flinching. "My orders were to gain access to your facility, identify all vulnerabilities, and then wait for the signal to begin exploitation." "The exploitation signal?" he repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Did you ever send it?" "I sent the initial confirmation that I was in position," she confessed. "But the rendezvous point I established for my handlers was a fake. It was a dead end designed to waste their time. Based on the chaos here, they would have been expecting my extraction tonight." She paused for a moment, then added, her voice flat and completely empty of emotion. "Instead of me, they got silence, and the dead bodies you left for them just outside the perimeter. I have cut my connection to them forever." Orion processed her words. She had not simply had a change of heart. She had incinerated her entire former life to ensure that he kept his. She had just declared war on her own people, and he needed to understand the reason. Orion demanded the cold, tactical truth, not some noble excuse that dissolved under pressure. In his world, every action had a cost, and this one was impossibly high. Cassia slid the pistol back into its holster with a practiced motion. Your daughter was not safe, she stated plainly. She required genuine protection, not the illusion of it. She let the words hang in the air. Your security detail was a joke, and your entire syndicate, Orion, is far too large to be brought down by common criminals and whispered intelligence. If this empire was destined to crumble, it would be a controlled demolition, not a chaotic collapse. It was a stunning reframe. She had not acted out of loyalty to him, but out of a professional assessment of his operational value. She saw the brutal power in his chaos and decided it was an asset worth preserving, but only if she controlled the architecture that held it all together. Orion inhaled slowly, the breath a quiet measure of his shock. Killing people was his standard operating procedure. It was efficient, it was permanent. Yet, as he looked at Cassia, he knew that ending her life would be like shattering the most perfect weapon he had ever held. She was the only true shield he had ever possessed. You have seen everything, he said, his hand sweeping across the smoldering wreckage that surrounded them. You know every vulnerability, every back channel, every single blind spot in my defenses. That makes you the most significant danger the Lyra Syndicate has ever faced. She met his gaze without hesitation. I am, she agreed, her voice steady. And I made the choice to defend it anyway. He moved toward her, shrinking the space between them until the atmosphere was thick with the scent of cordite and the weight of decisions yet to be made. In that case, you are no longer an employee, Orion announced, his voice flat and his eyes like polished stone. You are not my prisoner, and you are most certainly not a nanny anymore. He bent down, not to harm her, but to retrieve the tactical tablet from the rubble-strewn floor. He placed it back in her hands. The complex schematics of the compound glowed on the screen, lit by the erratic strobing of the emergency lights. The Hydra will send another team. The lower defenses must be rebuilt before sunrise. He looked at her, a silent transfer of power passing between them. Tell me where we begin. Cassia's eyes shifted from the glowing digital map to his face. The transformation was officially complete. She had demonstrated her ability to withstand the violence, the danger, and the crushing paranoia of his world. She had proven she could carry it all. Her finger tapped the screen, indicating the critical structural weaknesses near the primary generator. We begin with the firewalls, both the physical barriers and the digital ones, she commanded, her tone leaving no room for debate. And the head of your security is the traitor. Marcus led them straight to us. I require his complete access credentials and a dedicated team that answers only to me for the entire reconstruction. Her orders were immediate. Starting right now. A slow smile spread across Orion's face. It was a cold, predatory expression that contained zero warmth, only a deep and profound satisfaction. He had not found a lover or a subordinate. He had found an equal, a fundamental force of nature built from steel and ice. Consider it done, partner. He turned and walked toward the command center, leaving her to stand alone within the devastation he had created. Cassia watched him disappear, the heavy tablet feeling like a scepter in her hands. She stood in the ruins of his war, holding the blueprints for his new empire. The blood she had spilled had purchased her a place right beside the throne. She did not give a single backward glance toward the escape route she could have taken. This place was now her home. As Orion vanished into the deeper parts of the compound, Cassia remained amidst the destruction, the plans for his entire future glowing in her hands. The violent price she paid had earned her this position of power. The Lyra cleanup crew materialized moments later, their arrival as silent and efficient as ghosts. They moved like shadows across the shattered basement, their actions precise and almost reverent in the face of the recent carnage. No words were exchanged among them. They communicated with subtle hand signals and low, coded hums, methodically erasing every trace of the bloody attack. The air was thick with the sharp metallic smell of ozone from fried electronics and the acrid scent of discharged ammunition. Cassia paid no mind to the bodies on the floor, stepping over them to get to the main server installation. Her former life had ingrained a simple lesson in her. Destruction was always the necessary first step before building something stronger. She was once an instrument of demolition. Now she would become an architect of fortification. Her first priority was the security chief, Marcus. Orion had not needed to issue a command. The shared understanding had been forged in the chaos of the firefight. Loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and Marcus was bankrupt. He was already restrained in a deep-level interrogation cell, strapped to a solid steel chair. Orion led Cassia down a long, sterile white hallway, where the air seemed to grow colder with each step they took. "He is aware of all the redundancies," Orion said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He knows the locations of the dead drops, the names of the shell companies, every single piece of the infrastructure that keeps this operation running." Cassia gave a single sharp nod, her expression purely clinical. "I need his access codes," she replied, "and I need to understand the full pattern of his betrayal. How deeply did the Hydra manage to penetrate our systems?" They stepped inside the stark white room. Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. When he saw Cassia, the woman he knew only as the nanny, he let out a choked, dismissive scoff. "You brought a child?" Marcus spat, his words directed at Orion. "You brought the domestic help to witness this?" Cassia walked steadily toward him, completely ignoring the insult. She did not yell, she made no threats. She simply lifted her hand and pressed a single specific point just behind his collarbone. Marcus choked, a sudden sheen of sweat covering his face. It was not a violent strike, but a precise application of pressure, one that instantly compromised his lungs' ability to draw a complete breath. "The Hydra's main contact," Cassia demanded, her voice low and perfectly even. "Give me the name and the location. Now!" Marcus bucked against the thick restraints, his body convulsing as he struggled for air. He tried to form words, but all that came out was a wet, desperate gurgle. Orion observed the entire scene while leaning against the reinforced doorframe, his arms folded across his chest. He was not disturbed by the pain he was witnessing. He was analyzing her technique. She was working with a speed and precision that was far beyond any amateur. She was systematically dismantling Marcus's will, not with brute force, but with the chilling efficiency of a surgeon. "The codes for the offshore accounts," Cassia insisted, subtly shifting her position to apply a more focused and intense pressure. "You have 60 seconds, Marcus. If you fail, you will spend the next week of your life praying for a moment as merciful as this one." That was all it took. Marcus broke completely. He spewed a frantic stream of numbers, names, and locations. His confession was a desperate, broken torrent of information. Cassia listened intently, committing every single detail to her perfect memory. She took no notes. She simply absorbed it all. When he was finished, panting and utterly defeated, she finally stepped away. She looked across the room to Orion. The question in her eyes was silent, but perfectly clear. Should he be disposed of, or should he be imprisoned? Orion pushed himself off the wall. He did not even glance at the broken man in the chair. He only looked at Cassia. "You are in charge of security now," he said, and his words bestowed upon her complete and total authority. "So, you clean up your own messes." Cassia did not hesitate for a second. She had no need for a gun or a blade. From a discarded maintenance kit on a nearby table, she picked up a thin, flexible fiber optic cable. The execution was swift, silent, and impeccably clean. Orion waited until the heavy, soundproof door had sealed shut behind them before he spoke again. "You did not even flinch." "Flinching is inefficient," Cassia replied, her attention already focused on the stolen codes displayed on her tablet. "It wastes both time and critical resources. Our next step is to completely replace the internal communications network." Marcus left multiple backdoors for his friends. She gave him absolutely no room for emotional reflection. There was only cold, hard logic. Orion felt a brief spark of something that was almost admiration, a feeling he quickly extinguished with the harsh reality of their circumstances. She was a living weapon, and now that weapon was turned inward, protecting him and his entire world. The following 2 weeks became a relentless cycle of construction, interrogation, and internal purges. The Lyra compound was transformed from a headquarters into a modern-day fortress. Cassia patrolled the halls in tactical pants and a simple black t-shirt, wearing the uniform of a commander, not a servant. She hardly ever slept. On the rare occasions she did, it was on a small cot set up near the communications center. Orion watched her constantly. He saw how the other syndicate members, violent men hardened by years of intimidation, followed her instructions without a single question. She never raised her voice or made empty threats. She simply presented the threat assessment, her proposed solution, and the chilling consequences of failure with absolute clarity. They respected her because she never shied away from the necessary bloodshed. The most astonishing thing was the flawless way she transitioned between her different responsibilities. One afternoon, Orion discovered her in the brightly decorated playroom, surrounded by soft toys and colorful building blocks. Anna, his 4-year-old daughter, sat contentedly on a small chair while Cassia carefully braided little ribbons into her hair. The entire scene was utterly domestic and deceptively calm. "The perimeter alarms on the West Wing are registering as overly sensitive," Orion stated from the doorway, his large presence immediately draining the warmth from the room. Cassia tied off the final braid with a gentle, practiced knot. "They are calibrated to detect thermal signature variances smaller than a field mouse," she explained without looking up. "The Hydra used microdrones during their last assault. We will not be caught relying on simple line-of-sight defense systems ever again." She then smiled warmly at Anna. "Are you ready for your story time, sweetheart?" The little girl nodded, completely unaware that her nanny was simultaneously discussing high-level, military-grade security protocols. Cassia rose to her feet and looked straight at Orion. The change was instantaneous. The gentle warmth in her eyes evaporated, replaced by the calculating coldness of a master strategist. "I also located the source of the cash flow leak, Orion," she continued, her voice dropping to a confidential low pitch. "It is coming from the transport company you use in Monaco. They skimmed 7% during the last quarter. I have already initiated a freeze on their accounts and rerouted all assets through the Cyprus Holding Company. The cleanup team is already on its way." Orion could only stare at her, completely stunned. The effortless way she managed both the gentle, nurturing care of his daughter and the brutal, violent necessities of his life was deeply unsettling. She was not playing two different parts. She was, quite simply, both things at once. "You are terrifying," Orion stated, his voice quiet. It was not meant as an insult, but as a genuine assessment of her immense value. "I told you that I could handle all of it," she countered, her voice calm and even. "That includes the soft parts of your life, as well as the hard parts. You simply underestimated my total capacity." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He had built his entire adult life on a foundation of paranoia, trusting absolutely no one, and expecting betrayal from every direction. He had always believed that letting someone get close was the same as creating a fatal weakness. Cassia had just proven that sometimes letting the right person in was the equivalent of importing an impenetrable defense. Later that evening, Orion summoned her to his penthouse office. The atmosphere inside was a mix of expensive cognac and new leather, a scent of pure control. Far below, the city lights shimmered across the horizon, a silent map of enemies and assets. Orion poured a rich amber liquid into 2 heavy crystal glasses. Cassia accepted her glass with a steady hand. "The Hydra is wounded, but it is not dead," Orion stated, slowly swirling the contents of his glass. "They will test the new firewall relentlessly. They know that I have a new weapon. They are aware the rules of engagement have changed." "Let them try," Cassia responded, her voice calm as she took a deliberate sip. "They will find the gates are locked, and the sentinels are waiting." This single book contained his entire life, his powerful legacy, and his greatest weakness. He pushed the leather-bound volume across the polished desk, and it came to a rest in front of her. "This is not an employment contract, Cassia," he said, his voice lowering to a gravelly tone he only used for unbreakable commands. "You burned your own life down to save mine. You are officially compromised. You can never return to your former employers. To them, you are a traitor, a mission that failed, or a loose end that needs to be tied off." "I know what I am," she replied, her gaze firm. "Good," he said, "because in this house, you are not a prisoner. You are not a glorified bodyguard. You are not a nanny." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp, demanding her complete focus. "You are the foundation of this house. You are my second chair. Every piece of information, every asset, every secret that moves through this syndicate now flows through you. Control the intelligence, control the money, control all access." He nudged the heavy ledger the last few inches until it touched her hands. The book was dense, solid. It felt like the weight of an entire empire. "You earned your seat at this table," Orion said. "But I want you to understand something. The loyalty you showed me tonight must be permanent. Any hidden agenda, any action that serves yourself instead of me, and the consequences will be immediate and absolute. We are partners in this, but it is still my operation. Do you accept these terms?" Cassia wrapped her fingers around the worn leather binding of the ledger. The cold, hard reality of this new arrangement settled deep inside her. She had given up her freedom in exchange for power. She had sacrificed her anonymity for complete control. She had just stepped into a world of permanent, lethal danger, where the only thing that would keep her breathing was her ability to ensure Orion's survival. "I accept," she confirmed. Her voice was not triumphant, it was resolved. She immediately opened the ledger, her finger tracing down the first column of handwritten names, searching for old connections and potential weaknesses. She pulled her tactical tablet toward her, cross-referencing the book's entries with real-time financial data. "The first thing we need to address is the long-term debt to the Vulov family," Cassia began, her mind already working. "The amount is too high. We will liquidate the South American holdings. We need the cash, and we need to sever that tie. It is a weakness we cannot afford." Orion watched her as she worked. She was already fully immersed, focused entirely on the machinery of his empire, not on the man himself. She was examining his life's work with the cold, impartial eyes of both a master auditor and a military strategist. A subtle, dark smile of victory touched his lips. He had been searching for someone to stand with him in the darkness. Instead, he had found someone strong enough to wield the sword for him. Cassia sat across from him, sipping the expensive cognac, the entire lifeblood of his syndicate spread across the polished mahogany desk. She had become the architect of his paranoia, the executioner of his enemies, and the sworn protector of his only child. She had not merely survived his world, she had seized control of a critical piece of its very structure. She had claimed it as her own. Outside the window, the night was endless, filled with both threats and immense opportunity. And for the first time in many years, Orion did not feel the need to look over his shoulder. He had built his empire on a foundation of blood. Now, he would rule it with ice-cold logic and calculated necessity, standing side by side with his silent queen.